The night didn't feel normal. It wasn't the kind of darkness Harlem was used to. This was different, heavier, like the air itself knew something had already gone wrong, and was waiting for someone to notice. The streets were quieter than usual, no music drifting through windows, no laughter spilling from late-night corners. Even the wind moved carefully, as if it didn't want to disturb whatever had already taken place. That's when the call came in. Short, controlled, no details, just enough to make it clear something was wrong. Very wrong. Bumpy's men didn't ask questions. They didn't need to. When a message comes like that, at that hour, with that tone, you move. You don't think. You don't hesitate. You go. 3 cars. No headlights for the last stretch. Tires rolling slow against cracked pavement. Engines barely whispering as they approached the location. An abandoned property on the edge of where Harlem's influence started to fade into uncertainty. A place no one visited unless they had a reason. Tonight saw one did. The cars stopped, engine off for a moment. No one moved. That's when they felt it. Not saw it. Felt it. Something in the air, thick, unnatural, like walking into a room after an argument, except no voices remained. Only the aftermath. One of the men stepped out first. Tall, built like someone who had spent his entire life dealing with problems head-on. The kind of man others followed without asking why. He looked at the building. Then at the others. No words, just a nod. They moved together, slow, controlled, hands ready, but not rushed. These weren't amateurs. These were men who had seen things before, done things before, but even they could feel it now. Something wasn't right. The door to the building was already open. That was the first sign. No forced entry, no broken lock. Just open, like it had been left that way on purpose. They stepped inside and immediately the silence changed. Outside, it had been quiet. Inside, it was something else entirely. A kind of silence that presses against your ears, that makes every small movement sound louder than it should. Every breath, too noticeable. One of them whispered, almost instinctively, "Stay sharp." But even that felt unnecessary. They already were. The floor creaked under their weight as they moved deeper inside. The smell hit them next, not strong, not overwhelming, but enough to tell them this wasn't just another job. Something had happened here, something deliberate. They reached the first room. Empty. Second room. The same. But then they heard it. Not a voice. Not movement. Something else. A sound that didn't belong. Faint. Almost like it was coming from another part of the building. Or maybe echoing from earlier. They froze. Every instinct sharpened at once. The man in front raised his hand slightly. "Wait, listen." The sound came again, and this time it was clearer. Not loud, but unmistakable. One of the men shifted slightly. "What is that?" No one answered. Because no one wanted to say it. First they moved toward it, step by step, each one slower than the last. Until they reached the source. A larger room at the back. The door wasn't fully closed, just slightly pushed in, like whoever left didn't care enough to shut it properly. The man in front reached for it, paused for just a second, then pushed it open and everything changed. No one spoke. No one moved. Because in that moment, they understood. Not all at once, but enough to know this wasn't random, this wasn't chaos, this was planned, calculated. 11, that number would stay with them. Not because someone counted out loud, but because some things you don't need to say to understand. The room told its own story, not through noise, but through absence, through what was left behind, through what wasn't supposed to happen, but did. One of the men took a step back, then another. His breathing changed faster. Now. Even this was a man who had stood in situations most people wouldn't survive. A man who didn't flinch, didn't hesitate, didn't break. Until now he turned, walked out of the room. Not quickly, not dramatically, just left. The others didn't stop him, didn't call out, because they understood. Some say he made it outside before it hit him. Others believe it started the moment he turned away. But everyone agrees on one thing: he couldn't hold it in. He bent forward, hands on his knees, trying to catch his breath. But it wasn't working. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. And in that moment, the strongest man in the room broke. Not out of fear, but out of realization, because this wasn't about violence. It wasn't about territory. It wasn't even about power in the way they understood it. This was something else. something colder, something more calculated, inside. The others remained still, silent, processing, each one trying to make sense of what they were seeing, without saying it out loud because saying it would make it real and none of them were ready for that yet. One of them finally spoke, low controlled. This ain't business. No one disagreed because business had rules, and this had none. Another voice followed. Message? The word hung in the air, heavy, unanswered, but understood, because if it wasn't business, then it had to be something else. Something intentional. Something meant to be seen, or in this case, heard. Because what stayed with them wasn't just what they saw, it was what they understood from it. The precision, the number, the timing, This wasn't random. It couldn't be. And that's what made it worse. Outside, the man was still trying to steady himself, wiping his face, shaking his head slightly, like he was trying to push the moment away. But it wasn't leaving. It doesn't leave. Not when it hits. Like that, one of the others stepped out to check on him, didn't say anything, just stood nearby. Because sometimes words don't help after a few moments. The man finally spoke. Quietly. I've seen things. He stopped, swallowed, tried again. I've seen bad things. A pause then, but not like this. Inside, the others began to move again. Slowly, carefully, looking, observing, not touching more than they needed to. Because this wasn't about reacting, not yet. This was about understanding. Every detail mattered now. Every sign. Every clue. Because whatever happened here, it wasn't the end, it was the beginning. And they all knew it. One of them stepped back toward the door, looked out into the night, then said the one thing that shifted everything: we gotta tell Bumpy. Silence followed. Because that wasn't a simple decision. That meant bringing this directly to him. Not filtering it. Not softening it. Not delaying it. Telling him exactly what happened and what it meant, because it meant something. Something big. Something dangerous. Something that didn't just affect them, but everything around them. The man outside finally stood up, straight, took a deep breath, then another. He wasn't fully steady, but he was standing. And for men like him, that was enough. He looked back at the building, didn't go inside again, didn't need to. Some things. Once is enough. The others came out one by one. One rushed. No one spoke loudly. They didn't need to. The weight of the moment carried everything they needed to be said. They got back into the cars. Engines started. Still quiet, still controlled, but something had changed. You could feel it, not in what they said, but in how they moved, how they looked at each other, how they avoided saying certain things, because they all already knew. As the cars pulled away, the building disappeared back into the darkness, like it had never been there, like nothing had happened. But that wasn't true, because something had happened, something that would travel far beyond those walls, far beyond that night. Back in Harlem, the streets were still quiet, still unaware, but not for long, because when news like this reaches the right ears, it doesn't just spread, it transforms. And when it reached Bumpy Johnson, it wouldn't be just information, it would be a turning point. Some say he listened without interrupting, others believe he already knew. Something was coming before the words were spoken. But everyone agrees on one thing: when he heard what his men had heard, he didn't react the way they expected. No anger, no outburst, no immediate orders, just silence. The same kind of silence that filled that building. Heavy, controlled, dangerous. Because men like Bumpy don't react quickly, they think. They calculate that, they understand. And when they finally move, it's never without purpose. That night didn't end anything, it started something. Something that couldn't be undone. Something that would change the balance of power in ways no one fully understood yet. And somewhere, in the back of every man's mind who was there, one thought remained. If this was a message, then who was it really meant for? And more importantly, before the fear, there was silence. Before the legend, there was observation. And before the name Bumpy Johnson carried weight across Harlem, it belonged to a man who understood something most people never learned. Power is not taken in a moment. It is built over time. He wasn't born into influence, he wasn't handed respect, and he didn't grow up believing the world would ever be fair. From an early age he saw how things worked, not how people said they worked, but how they actually did. Who had control, who didn't, who survived, and who disappeared without explanation. Some say he learned more by watching than others did by speaking. Others believe he trusted very few people, because he realized early that trust was often the first mistake. But one thing is certain, he paid attention while others reacted. He studied, while others rushed. He waited, and that difference would shape everything that came later. He wasn't the loudest voice in any room. In fact, most people didn't notice him at first. And that was exactly how he preferred it, because when you're not being watched, you can see everything. Harlem, at the time, wasn't just a place, it was a system, a structure of influence, control, and survival. Every corner had its own rules. Every street had its own hierarchy, and Bumpy understood something most didn't. You want to survive in a system like that. You don't fight it blindly. You learn it, you move within it, and eventually, you reshape it. Some say he had a temper when he was younger, quick, sharp, unforgiving. But they also say he learned to control it in a way that few ever could. There are stories, quiet ones, that suggest he used poetry as a way to discipline his mind. Not because he wanted to be seen differently, but because he understood something deeper. If you can control your thoughts, you can control your actions. And if you can control your actions, you can control outcomes. That kind of thinking doesn't come from impulse. It comes from awareness, from discipline, from understanding that every move has consequences. And Bumpy didn't believe in unnecessary moves. He believed in precision. As he grew older, that mindset began to set him apart, not just from ordinary people, but from the very men who operated in the same world as him. While others built reputations through noise and visible dominance, Bumpy built his through consistency. Reliability. Control. He didn't need to prove himself loudly because the results spoke for him, and results travel faster than words. People began to notice, not immediately, but gradually, a quiet recognition that this was someone different, someone who didn't just react to situations, but anticipated them. Some say he could read a room in seconds, understand who held real power, and who only pretended to. Others believe he saw patterns where others saw chaos, and once you see patterns, you can predict outcomes. That's when things start to change. Because in a world built on uncertainty, the man who understands what comes next becomes dangerous. Not because he's unpredictable, but because he's not. Because while everyone else is guessing, he already knows. And that kind of certainty creates fear. But Bumpy didn't rely on fear alone. In fact, fear was never his primary tool. Respect came first. Always. Always. Not the kind of respect that's demanded. The kind that's earned, built slowly through actions. Through decisions, through consistency, over time. People trusted him, not because they had to, but because they believed he operated by a code. And that code mattered, even in a world where rules were often ignored. Because having a code doesn't make you weak, it makes you predictable in a way that others can rely on. And in an unpredictable environment, that becomes power. He didn't betray easily, he didn't make unnecessary enemies, he didn't act without purpose, and that made people comfortable around him, but also cautious, because there's something unsettling about a man who doesn't reveal everything, who's thinking, who listens more than he speaks, who acts only when necessary. Some say that was his greatest strength. Others believe it was what made him dangerous, because silence can be more intimidating than noise. As his presence grew, so did his influence. Not in obvious ways, not through public displays of control, but through connections. Relationships, understanding who mattered and why. He knew that power wasn't just about what you could do, it was about who stood with you, and more importantly, who didn't stand against you. That distinction mattered, because avoiding conflict is often more powerful than winning it. He built alliances carefully, never rushing, never forcing, letting things develop naturally, because forced loyalty doesn't last, but earned loyalty, that's different, that stays. And over time, those connections began to form something larger. A network, a structure. Not visible to everyone, but strong enough to hold. And that's when the shift began. Because once you have structure, you just survive anymore. You influence, you shape outcomes, you control direction, and Bumpy understood that better than most. Some say he never forgot where he came from. Others believe that memory was exactly what drove him, because when you've seen how unstable life can be, you don't take control for granted. You protect it, you maintain it, you expand it carefully, never too fast, never too obvious. because rapid growth attracts attention, and attention can be dangerous. So he moved strategically, step by step, building something that wasn't just powerful, but sustainable. That's what separated him from others, not just ambition, but patience. Because anyone can rise quickly, but staying there, that requires something else entirely. Discipline, awareness, control, and Bumpy had all three. By the time his name began to circulate beyond immediate circles, it carried meaning, not just identity. People spoke it differently, with a certain level of caution, not out of fear alone, but out of understanding that this was someone who didn't operate like others, who didn't follow predictable patterns, who didn't make careless mistakes, and that made him difficult to challenge. Because how do you confront someone who doesn't give you an opening, who doesn't react the way you expect, who doesn't play by the same visible rules? You don't. You watch, you wait, just like he did. And that created a unique kind of balance, one where conflict was minimized, not because it couldn't happen, but because it wasn't worth it. That's real power, not forcing control, but creating a situation where resistance feels unnecessary, or even dangerous, and Bumpy achieved that without ever needing to announce it, without ever needing to prove it publicly, because by that point, it was already understood. Some say he could have pushed further, taken more, expanded, faster, but he didn't. And that wasn't hesitation, it was strategy, because he knew something others didn't: power that grows too fast, draws attention from places you can't control, and once that happens, everything changes. So he stayed measured, focused, calculated, always aware of the bigger picture, because for Bumpy, this was never about a single moment, it was about longevity, sustainability, building something that could withstand pressure, and pressure was always coming, it always does, especially in a place like Harlem where every gain creates a reaction, every shift creates resistance, every move is watched, evaluated, and sometimes challenged. But by the time those challenges came, Bumpy was ready, not because he prepared for a specific event, but because he prepared for everything. That's the difference. And that's what made him who he was. Not just a figure of influence, not just a name people recognized, but a presence, something you could feel, even when he wasn't there, because true power doesn't need to be visible at all times, it just needs to be understood. And by the time the events of that night began to unfold, by the time his men heard what they heard, and saw what they saw, Bumpy Johnson was no longer just a man navigating the system, he had become something else entirely, a force within it, calculated, measured, unshaken. But even a man like that has limits, lines that exist beneath the surface, unspoken, but real. And what happened that night didn't just challenge the system, it challenged him, not his strength, not his influence, but something deeper, something personal. Because when a man who has built his world on control encounters something that exists outside of it, the response isn't immediate, it isn't emotional, it's something far more dangerous, it's quiet, it's deliberate. Harlem had its own rhythm, not loud, not chaotic in the way outsiders imagined. It moved with purpose, with structure, with an understanding that didn't need to be explained to those who lived inside it. Daytime belonged to survival, night belonged to influence, and somewhere in between, power quietly shifted hands. But that rhythm, steady, controlled, predictable in its own way, was beginning to change. Not all at once, not in a way you could point to and say, that's where it started. It was more subtle than that. Looking through the situation, analyzing, breaking it down piece by piece. Because this wasn't something you respond to quickly. This wasn't a street dispute. This wasn't about territory or money or reputation. This was something else. Something deliberate, something designed. And that meant it had a purpose. The question was, what was it? One of the men shifted slightly. Not out of impatience, but tension. Because the longer Bumpy stayed silent, the heavier the room felt. Finally, he spoke, one sentence, calm, controlled. They wanted this to be seen. Not loud, not aggressive, but certain that, and that changed everything. Because if it was meant to be seen, then it wasn't random, it wasn't emotional, it wasn't uncontrolled, it was a message. And messages have targets. Another pause. Then one of the men asked carefully, you think it's about us? Bumpy didn't answer right away, because that question was bigger than it sounded. He stood up slowly, walked a few steps, hands behind his back, thinking, then finally it's not just about us. That landed differently, because just us meant something contained, something manageable. But this wasn't contained, it was broader, wider, more dangerous. Because when something isn't just about you, you can't control all the variables, you can't predict every move. And that creates risk. But Bumpy didn't show concern. He showed focus. Because risk is something you manage, not something you fear. He turned back toward them. Double quotes 11. He said the number like it mattered. Because it did. Numbers aren't random in situations like this. They're chosen, calculated, symbolic, double quotes, not 10. Not 12. Another pause. That's intentional. The men exchanged brief glances, because they understood what that meant. This wasn't chaos. This was design. And design means planning. Planning means thought. And thought means there's more coming. One of them spoke again. So what do we do? That question carried weight, because it assumed something. That action was immediate. That response should be direct. But Bumpy didn't move like that. He never had. Instead, he asked something else. What do they expect us to do? The room went quiet again, because that wasn't the question they were asking themselves. They were asking what they should do. Bumpy was asking what the other side expected, because that's where strategy begins. Not with your move, but with theirs. If you understand what your opponent expects, you can break it, control it, use it against them. That's how power shifts, not through reaction, through disruption of expectation. They want noise, one of the men said slowly. Reaction. Bumpy nodded once. Exactly. And then we don't give it to them. That wasn't what they expected, at all. Because everything about the situation demanded. Response, visible, immediate, strong, single quotes, that's how most people would move. That's how most leaders would act. But Bumpy wasn't most leaders, because he understood something deeper. Reaction creates clarity, and clarity helps your opponent if they know how you respond. They can prepare for it, control it, predict it. But if you don't react the way they expect, you create uncertainty, and uncertainty creates fear. That's where power begins to shift. But we just sit, another man asked, not disrespectfully, but honestly, because from the outside, that's what it sounded like, doing nothing. Bumpy looked at him, steady, double quotes, no, a pause, we prepare. That word carried more weight than action ever could, because preparation isn't visible, it doesn't announce itself, it builds quietly, and when it's done right, it changes everything. He moved back to his seat, sat down slowly, and then began to speak again, not loudly, not forcefully, but with clarity. They crossed a line, no emotion, just fact. And once that happens, he paused slightly. You don't respond halfway. That landed because it meant one thing when this moves. It moves completely, no hesitation, no uncertainty, final, but not yet. Still not yet, because timing matters more than anything. Move too early, you lose advantage. Move too late, you lose control. The key is knowing when. And Bumpy wasn't guessing, he was calculating. We need to know who's behind it, one of the men said. Bumpy nodded. We will not, we'll try. Not we think. We will, because certainty creates direction. And when we do, another pause, everything changes. The room felt different now, not lighter, but clearer. Because uncertainty had been replaced with purpose. They didn't know exactly what was coming, but they knew something was. And they knew Bumpy was already ahead of it. That's what gave them confidence, not the situation, not the outcome, but the man leading it. Because Bumpy didn't move without understanding, didn't act without reason, didn't respond without control, and that made all the difference. Outside, Harlem continued to move, but underneath that movement, the pressure remained unseen, unspoken, but growing. Because moments like this don't disappear. They expand, they influence, they change behavior, even when people don't fully understand. Why some say words started to spread. Not details, not specifics, just awareness that something had happened, something serious, something that shifted the balance. And when balance shifts, everyone feels it, even if they don't know where it started, and that's how power works. It doesn't need explanation, it just needs presence. Back inside, Bumpy's focus didn't break. He wasn't thinking about what had already happened. He was thinking about what it meant, what it represented. Because events like that are never isolated. They're signals, indicators of something larger, and if you understand the signal, you understand the direction. That's where advantage comes from. Some believe he already had an idea, others think he was building one. But either way, he wasn't in the dark, not completely, because men like Bumpy don't allow themselves to be. He began giving quiet instructions, not commands, not orders that echoed, just controlled direction. Watch specific areas, listen for certain names, don't engage. That last one mattered most, because engagement creates exposure, and exposure, without full understanding, is a risk he wouldn't take. Not now here. His men moved accordingly. No resistance, no questioning, because by now, they understood his process. And more importantly, they trusted it. That trust was built over time, through consistency, through results, through decisions that proved themselves. And now, in a moment like this, that trust held everything together. Days passed, then more, and still, no visible response, no public reaction, nothing that could be traced back to Bumpy from the outside. It looked like nothing had changed. But inside, everything was moving. Quietly, carefully, strategically, because silence isn't absence, it's control, and Bumpy was using it perfectly. Somewhere along the line, the people responsible for that night expected something, a reaction, a shift, a shine that their message had landed, but they didn't get it, and that created something they didn't plan for, uncertainty. Because when you send a message, and there's no response, you start to question that it worked, was it understood, or did it miss completely? That doubt is powerful. More powerful than reaction sometimes, because it breaks confidence. And once confidence breaks, mistakes follow. That's what Bumpy was waiting for. Not the perfect moment, but the right one. The one where the other side starts to lose control, starts to reveal itself. And when that happens, you don't chase, you don't rush, you move precisely, decisively without hesitation. Because by then, the outcome is already decided, and somewhere, deep beneath the surface at moment, was getting closer. War is not always declared. Sometimes it begins in silence. No speeches, no warnings, no visible lines being drawn. Just movement, careful, calculated, almost invisible. That's how Bumpy Johnson chose to respond. Not with noise, not with force that could be seen or traced, but with something far more dangerous. Control. After that night, nothing about his approach was accidental. Every conversation mattered. Every meeting had a purpose. Every silence was intentional. He didn't gather crowds, didn't call for loyalty in loud, dramatic ways. Instead, he reduced everything. Fewer words, fewer people, fewer visible moves. Because the smaller the circle, the stronger the control. Some say he began meeting people, one at a time, not in the usual places, not in locations tied to his name, but in neutral spaces, places that meant nothing to anyone watching. Because when you want to stay unseen, you remove patterns, and Bumpy understood patterns better than anyone. Each meeting looked simple from the outside, short, controlled, quiet, but inside everything was being built, piece by piece. Information first, always information, because without it, there's no strategy. He didn't ask direct questions. He didn't need to. Instead, he listened, let others speak, let them reveal what they knew, without realizing they were doing it. Because people always reveal more than they intend, if you give them the space to do it. And Bumpy gave him that space, but only for a moment. Just enough. Then he moved on, because staying too long creates risk, and risk was something he was eliminating at every level. Some say he already had names, others believe he was conferring them, but what mattered wasn't just who was involved, it was how deep it went. Because this wasn't about one group or one decision. It was something larger, something connected, and connections are where power lives. If you understand the connections, you understand the system, and if you understand the system, you can control it. That's what Bumpy was building, not just a response, a map, a structure of influence, who talks to who answers to who moves without being seen. Because once that's clear, nothing is hidden anymore. At the same time, he began adjusting his own network, not dramatically, not in ways that would attract attention, just small shifts, quiet repositioning. Some people were moved closer, others pushed further out, not as punishment as protection, because not everyone needed to be involved, and the more people who knew, the weaker the plan became. So he tightened control, reduced exposure, focused only on what mattered. That's how real strategy works, not expanding, refining. Some of his men noticed the change, not in what he said, but in how he operated. More precise, more focused, less tolerance for unnecessary movement, and that told them everything they needed to know. Something big was coming, but they still didn't know what, because Bumpy didn't reveal outcomes, he revealed direction, and only when necessary. That's how he maintained control, not just over the streets, but over information itself. Meanwhile, outside his circle, something else was happening. The pressure that had been building started to shift. Not disappear, shift, because the people behind that night were watching, waiting for a reaction, but they weren't getting one, No retaliation, no visible resistance, nothing that confirmed their message had landed the way they intended, and that created doubt. Small at first, barely noticeable, but growing, because uncertainty eats at confidence, and confidence is what holds operations together. Without it, people hesitate, and hesitation creates mistakes. That's when Bumpy began to move. Still quietly, still controlled. But now, with purpose. One connection at a time, one influence at a time. He didn't target people directly, he targeted positions, roles, points of control, because removing a person creates noise, but removing their influence changes everything. And often, number one sees it happen. That's the difference. That's where power truly shifts. Some businesses that had been under pressure suddenly stabilize. Not dramatically, just enough. Enough to suggest that something had changed, but not enough to draw attention, because obvious changes raise questions, and questions lead to exposure. So everything remains subtle, balanced, controlled. At the same time, certain individuals began to feel something different. Not fear in the traditional sense, but awareness, like they were being watched, not followed, not threatened, just observed. That kind of pressure is harder to deal with, because you can't confront it.
You can't fight it.
You can only feel it, and when enough people feel it, behavior changes. That's what Bumpy was creating. Not panic roll, because panic spreads uncontrollably, spreads with precision. Some say he allowed certain things to happen, small disruptions, minor events that seemed unrelated, but weren't, because each one revealed something. Who reacted, who stayed quiet, who moved differently, and from that, he learned, adjusted, refined. That's how strategy evolves. Not through fixed plans, but through adaptation. M. Bumpy adapted faster than anyone, because he wasn't reacting to events, he was shaping them. Meanwhile, the people behind the original act began to feel the shift. Not clearly, not all at once, but enough to notice. Something was different. The environment they had influenced was no longer responding the same way. Resistance wasn't visible, but neither was compliance. And that's a dangerous place to be, because when people stop reacting predictably, you lose control, and when you lose control, you start making decisions based on uncertainty. That's where mistakes happen, that's where systems begin to crack. And Bumpy was waiting for that, not forcing it, allowing it, guiding it, because forcing pressure can backfire, but guiding it creates direction. Somewhere in the process, lines of communication began to weaken, not cut, just disrupted. Messages took longer, responses became inconsistent, coordination slipped. Nothing major, obvious, but enough to create friction, and friction slows everything down. In a system built on precision, that's a problem, because once timing is affected, everything else follows. That's how structures weaken. Not through one big failure, but through small, consistent disruptions. And Bumpy knew exactly where to apply them, because by now, he understood the system, not completely, but enough to know where to press, where to wait, where to move, and where to remain completely still. That last part mattered most, because sometimes the strongest move is doing nothing at all, or at least nothing visible. Some of his men started to see the results, not directly, but in patterns, in how the streets felt, more stable in some areas, more uncertain in others, like something was being rebalanced, but without a clear source. And that was the point, because if no one can identify where the change is coming from, they can't stop it, they can't respond to it, they can only react blindly. And blind reactions are easy to control. That's where Bumpy had the advantage, not in strength, not in numbers, but in clarity. He knew what he was doing, why he was doing it, and how it would unfold. That level of understanding is rare, and dangerous, because once you reach it, you don't just participate in the system, you control it. And slowly, that control began to return, not loudly, not visibly, but undeniably. The pressure that had been building against Harlem was being redirected, not removed, redirected, back toward its source, but in a way that couldn't be traced, couldn't be proven, couldn't be stopped, because by the time anyone realized what was happening, it was already too late. That's how Bumpy operated, not in moments, in sequences, each step connected, each move building on the last until the outcome was no longer a possibility, but a certainty. And by the time Section 5 reaches its end, thing becomes clear this was never about revenge, it was about control. And control, once taken back, is never given away easily. Power changes things. Not just the world around you, but the world inside you. By the time the dust had settled quietly, almost invisibly, Harlem felt different again. Not the way it used to. Not the same rhythm, not the same energy. It was stable, yes, but it wasn't untouched. Because stability that comes after pressure carries memory, and memory changes behavior. The streets were calmer now. Businesses moved again. Conversations returned. People stepped outside without the same hesitation they had felt weeks before. On the surface, it looked like balance had been restored, but underneath, something had shifted. Because once people see how quickly things can change, they never fully forget it. And neither did Bumpy. He had done what needed to be done. Not loudly, not publicly, but effectively. The pressure had been redirected. The system had stabilized, and those who had tried to influence it had lost their footing. Some disappeared from relevance, others adjusted, quietly stepping back into places where they were less visible, less powerful. As certain, there was no announcement, no moment where anyone stood up and declared victory, because that's not how it works at that level. Real outcomes don't need recognition. They exist whether people see them or not. And Bumpy understood that better than anyone. But even as the outside world returned to something close to normal, inside, things were different. Because power isn't just something you hold, it's something you carry. And the more of it you have, the heavier it becomes. His men noticed it first. Not in what he said, but in what he didn't say. Fewer conversations, shorter responses, more time spent in silence, not distracted, not distant, just deeper, like his thoughts were somewhere else, processing something no one else could see. Some believed he was simply tired, others thought he was already focused on what came next. But a few understood something different. This wasn't about exhaustion, this was about awareness. Because once you've seen how far power can reach, you can't unsee it. You can't go back to thinking in smaller terms. You can't pretend things are simpler than they are. That kind of understanding changes you, and it isolates you. Not physically, but mentally, because the decisions you make aren't like anyone else's. They carry consequences that extend beyond individuals, beyond moments, beyond even the present. And that way is something you carry alone. Bumpy. He never spoke about it. He didn't explain his thoughts, didn't share the full picture. That wasn't his way. But you could feel it in the pauses between his words, in the way he observed more than he acted, in the way he seemed to be thinking not just about now, but about everything that could follow. Because moments like that don't end cleanly, they echo, they leave traces. And those traces can turn into something else if you're not careful. That's what he was managing now. Not conflict, not opposition, but potential. Because once you've shifted the balance of power, you create new possibilities, new reactions, new risks. And if you don't control those, they grow, sometimes into something bigger than what you started with. That's the real challenge, not winning, maintaining. Because maintaining requires constant awareness, constant adjustment, constant control, and control is never permanent. It's something you protect every day. Some of his closest men began to see the difference. More clearly, they had always respected him, trusted him, followed his direction without hesitation. But now, there was something else, kind of distance, not emotional, not personal, but strategic, like he was operating on a level they couldn't fully reach and maybe never would. That realization didn't create doubt, it created understanding, because not everyone is meant to carry that kind of weight, not everyone is built for it. And Bumpy was, but that didn't make it easy, it just made it possible. There were moments rubberia where he would sit in silence longer than usual, not working, not planning, just thinking. Those who saw it didn't interrupt, didn't ask questions, because they knew whatever he was processing wasn't something you could simplify. It wasn't about a single event or a single decision. It was about everything connected to it, the past, the present, the future, all tied together. Because in his world, nothing exists in isolation. Everything leads to something else, and every choice creates a chain. That's what he carried now. Not just the result of what had happened, but the responsibility for what came next. Some say this is where most people fail, not in the moment of action, but in the aftermath. Because it's easy to react, it's harder to sustain, to remain focused when there's no immediate threat, to stay disciplined when things feel stable again. That's when mistakes happen. That's when people relax, let their guard down, assume things are under control. But Bumpy didn't make that mistake. He couldn't, because he knew something others didn't. Stability is temporary, always. It doesn't matter how strong the system is, how well it's built, how carefully it's maintained. There is always something waiting, something building, something preparing to test it again. That's the nature of power. It attracts challenge, and the stronger it becomes, the bigger the challenge. So he stayed focused not on what had already happened, but on what could happen, and that required something most people don't have: discipline without urgency. The ability to remain sharp, even when there's no immediate reason to be. That's rare, and that's what kept him ahead. Harlem continued to move. The rhythm returned. People adapted, as they always do, because life doesn't stop. Even after moments that change everything, it adjusts, finds a new balance, creates a new normal. But that normal is never the same as before, and everyone felt it, even if they couldn't explain it. Because when power shifts, it leaves an imprint, something subtle, something unspoken, but real. Some people became more cautious, more aware of their surroundings, more selective in their actions. Others leaned into the stability, focused on rebuilding, on moving forward, on leaving the past behind. But the past doesn't disappear, not completely. It stays in memory and behavior and decisions. And for Bumpy, it stayed in a different way. Not as something to remember, but as something to remember, but as something to learn from. Because every event, every shift, every moment of pressure teaches you something if you're paying attention. And he always was. That's what separated him. Not just intelligence, but awareness. The ability to see beyond the moment, to understand not just what happened, but why, and what it means going forward. That's where real power lies, not in action but in understanding. And that understanding comes with a cost, because once you reach that level, there's no turning it off, no stepping away, no going back to simpler thinking. You see everything differently, every situation, every decision, every possibility. And that changes how you live, how you move, how you think. It creates distance, not from people, but from simplicity. And simplicity is something you lose when you carry that kind of responsibility. But Bumpy accepted that. He didn't fight it, didn't question it, because he knew this was the price, not money, not risk, but weighed the constant awareness that everything you do matters more than most people will ever understand, and that awareness never leaves. Some say he became colder after that, more controlled, more precise. Others believe he had always been that way, and this just revealed it more clearly. The truth probably sits somewhere in between, because moments like that don't create who you are, they reveal it, and what it revealed was a man who understood power at a level few ever reach. Not just how to gain it, not just how to use it, but how to carry it. And that is what defines legacy, not the moments people see, but the weight you carry when no one is watching. Because that's where the real story exists. Not in the noise, but in the silence that follows it. And for Bumpy Johnson, that silence was where everything truly changed.